Hi guys, and welcome back to Africa My Love. My name is the Rich Mogul, and today I'm joined by my co-host Mbongeni.
Hi everyone, hi Tim.
Hi, how are you?
I try. I try to be great.
That's good, as long as you're trying your best. Okay, so today we will be discussing the concept of being a coconut and how it applies to language and identity within the Black community.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a very timely topic, particularly with what's happening in the world. The worldwide beef, the rap civil war that they've dubbed between Drake and Kendrick Lamar. It's also got a lot of identity issues that get wrapped up in there. But in a South African context, the coconut is seen as a person who is black on the outside but white on the inside, just like the fruit, or is it a fruit or a nut? I don't even know. But yeah, so that's where the term comes from. Yeah. And so I guess if we look at this Kendrick Lamar Drake moment, there is a little bit of that element to it as well, where Drake is wearing blackness in certain instances, but how much of that is actually his identity? So he's using the language, but not being the thing that language came from.
And I think in our context also, I think there's kind of, it's like when somebody's like well educated or they speak well, then it's always associated with you being a coconut. So in our context, it's not necessarily like in the Drake scenario. It can be like...
No, so particularly for people who grew up with a certain type of education or speak with a certain accent, there's a lot that then gets inferred about you, and part of that is what your identity is and how close you are to blackness or how much of a sellout you are, just based on how you sound, and also the words you choose to use. So for me, I found that a lot of people have a problem with the fact that I think and dream in English, because that was my mother tongue.
Same.
And so it's always been an issue for me to now have to kind of prove my blackness.
That's real. Because our first language at home is also English. We don't speak like in this class or anything. So we speak English. So it's kind of, but at least I can speak the other languages. So it's not like I just speak English only. So I think that kind of helps me.
I can speak the other languages quite well as well, but just this idea of being always speaking English, particularly when you're in a social setting, people have an expectation that you would switch. And I articulate myself better in English than any other language. So when I'm in a conversation, I want to make sure you understand what I'm saying, whereas I'd be limited in terms of vocabulary. There's certain words that just don't exist in our languages.
That's true. Personally, I think speaking English at home, I would say, also helped a lot with being able to articulate. Well, that was the only way I could articulate myself in English. And then I started learning how to speak other languages, such as like Zulu and Xhosa, but I spoke Zulu first, and then I started speaking Xhosa and other languages as well. And I started being able to articulate myself more in this class than or in Zulu. So for me, it's kind of the opposite. But I have always felt the pressure of just being like from an English-speaking home or going to like a Model C school, being around people with the accents that would be deemed as like proper, or people who use very big words. I've always had that pressure to want to be able to speak like that, but also through reading and stuff like that, I've been able to expand my vocabulary. But I think there's always that underlying thing of always wanting to like speak better, and be able to articulate yourself better. So I always have that.
So from my primary school days, so I was in boarding school from like grade 3 till grade 7. So I think that artificial environment made English that much more entrenched in my identity, particularly because you're in this school, there's people from all over the country, so everyone just ends up defaulting to English, and also generally our headmaster was white, and so it was just, it wasn't a rule, but it was just known that it's frowned upon to use vernac.
No, they would even mention it though.
Yeah.
Like, don't speak your language until you speak English.
They wouldn't say it, but it was known. Well, in my context. So I think I really delved into learning vernac more so it becoming a part of my identity in high school. Because now when you get to high school, people make fun of you, and you're at that point in time where you want to be accepted, you want to fit in. And so I had to learn. I learned Tswana very quickly. I mean, I'd grown up with Zulu in the household, and yeah, so that wasn't like necessarily an issue. Watching SABC, all of that stuff, I could understand all these languages. It was just articulating myself in them. So it's only in high school where I really solidified, and particularly Setswana was like I just learned it very fast because I had to.
Yeah. I also grew up in. Well, we grew up in Yoho, and so like there was so much exposure to vernac and stuff like that. So even just speaking English was frowned upon, being considered like, oh, she thinks she's better. So I had to kind of adapt and always learn how to speak vernac, like Zulu or Swahili. Like in every environment that I found myself in, I always just wanted to make sure that I could understand the language and be able to communicate in the language, because there's also a difference between speaking to somebody in like a foreign language, whereas where you're speaking in their language, no matter how bad it is, it gives them that sense of, oh, they're trying, they understand me. So I always wanted to hang on to that, and I am genuinely just good with languages as well, so I pick on them very fast.
Well, I think I've always kind of been surrounded by the expat community. I genuinely, like my whole life, I've been surrounded by foreigners. So English also became particularly important from that aspect, because it's not like we're not speaking our own languages, because if we did, we wouldn't understand each other.
Exactly.
So English became necessary from that perspective. I mean, my best friend is from Nigeria. I've got lots of friends back in Botswana from different tribes. I mean, you know what I mean? So English became a center. And that's how, particularly because of my childhood, it became part of who I am and how I think. And then in the classroom as well, people expect you to be smarter than everyone else. I remember this one particular story in high school. This girl that no one had heard her speak, like in class or anything. And she was number one and I was number two. And they clowned me. Like, they clowned me throughout that time, because they were like, how did she beat you when, like, you know what I mean? Exactly. So it's like these weird cues between, okay, so maybe you sound smarter because you speak English. It's not necessarily true. It's a different thing in terms of language and being able to process logic. Yeah,
and even in our household, for instance, with the language barriers, because my dad is from Zim and he obviously speaks in Ndebele and Xhosa, and my mom is from South Africa and she speaks English and Afrikaans. So then English was kind of the main ground for them, and that's why we speak English in our household.
Yeah, so that mixing of different cultures, then English becomes centered in that sense. But then, I mean, I still can handle myself when I'm in the township, when I'm back at my grandmother's house, when I'm with cousins. It does come out, but like it's just not the first thing. And it's almost like I'm performing blackness when I then speak vernac. Particularly when I'm speaking, like, when you're speaking to adults, because they notice your little accent slips, they notice that you're pronouncing words wrong, they're using, so you see what I'm saying, where I guess in Joburg, your vernac doesn't have to be perfect and pure, but back in KZN, it's like, people notice. And so it's actually safer to speak English.
KZN is just a different story.
Okay, so personally, because of my eclectic upbringing, so I was born in Zimbabwe and I did my high school in Botswana, and my working life has been in South Africa. So ever since adulthood, I've been in this country. and I've got grandparents from Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe. So I have this mix, and so I don't identify myself with a tribe or a language. I just identify myself with blackness as a whole. And that's just what made sense for me, because everywhere I've gone, I've always been an African. Everywhere I've gone, I've always been black. But I've definitely not fit in everywhere I've gone. So I've had to make community with the broader diaspora, so to speak. And even in the way that I process my identity is, I think I'm black first before I'm even African. And maybe that's also got to do with media, because 98% of what we watch on TV is from America. So maybe that also, and they are black Americans.
I would also agree with that because I relate to that. But then in terms of, I think the point was language and identity. I think the problem that we have as the black community is that, because we obviously also, we have a lot of people who are still like slaves within their minds. So I think the biggest problem is that we associate English with intelligence and just like dignity and respect. And it comes down to, we don't even realize how problematic that is, but it's just in the simple ways that we see that how the, like for instance, the Model C kids always read the obituaries at funerals. And the kids who can't speak English that well will be doing all of the labor. Like, it's you already associating that, oh, this person doesn't deserve to do hard work. Magayo
becomes a class indicator.
It becomes like, it's
communicates
classist in a
class,
way.
exactly.
And it's like, even I can say the exact same thing as you, and you articulate yourself so well in English and use big words, and everybody's gonna be like, oh, that's a word, he's cooking, even if you're talking nonsense. And then I can come and say the exact same thing, but not with the same language, or just and it's like, oh, people will just not necessarily respect what I'm saying, which I've constantly had to deal with also. It's because like, oh, I'm not using big words, or I don't have that specific accent where it's, you're not taking in what I'm saying, or you're not respecting what I'm saying, or it's like, oh, you're just too woke, or you're just too this. But then when somebody else with the accent or the specific English comes and says the exact same thing I've been saying, it's like, oh, you're so wise, oh, you're spitting. So I think we kind of need to free ourselves from that kind of.
We do need to free ourselves of the colonizer mindset. Because there is definitely trauma that comes from having been punished for speaking vernac in school. And so that punishment is associated with you not having good grades, you not being a good student. So I think that might be where it comes from. But also there is this in-group dynamic that happens, and so people can gravitate to smaller groups than black as an identity, smaller groups than African as an identity, and those smaller groups are a country, for example. So someone like me who's lived in 3 countries, now where's my loyalty? I love all 3 of these countries. And then they even then go further to tribes or villages, and again I have relatives who are multicultural. So I am Xhosa in some instances, I am Zulu in some instances, I am Shangani in some instances, I'm Shona in some instances. But now no one wants you to go through your genetic makeup and be like, I am 23% Zulu and 48% whatever. And what I find is patriarchy also has a role to play, where it's just like, your identity is whatever your father's identity, that's your identity.
That's so great.
Oh, that's interesting, because I think in terms of self-expression, slang is particularly important for separating and dividing people into in-groups and out-groups. So when you understand a certain lingo, that lingo becomes an identifier of a certain group. And yeah, I mean, I've already started this thing speaking about hip-hop and the African-American experience, just from watching people like us on TV. Well, let me speak for myself. Watching people who are black on TV, they were American, so I wanted to sound like them, because I was like, okay, so these are the good blacks who get to be on TV. These are the good blacks who can interact in this white world. And it helps you then learn the lessons and how to navigate in this world. And they going through racism, we went through what we went through, which is completely different, but there's analogies that kind of apply. And then as you get older and you learn about things like, oh, the solidarity that would happen between apartheid and the civil rights movement, fighting apartheid and fighting for civil rights. So those linkages as well make me really lean into this idea that, you know what, I'm black first before anything else, because we're all a big family.
Exactly.
Yeah. Even though they're outsiders like Drake.
Cut the gap.
Cut.
Yeah. I think also it's important, like, especially with our feelings, we always like feel certain things, or there's certain things that we struggle with, but we're not necessarily able to articulate them. That's why I think reading is so important, because history always repeats itself, and there's always somebody who's went through something similar to you. And sometimes we always think that we're the only ones going through that, but like through reading and things like watching television, you're able to see the stories of other people and able to relate to them, as well as articulate and see how they've went forward. So I think language is important in that sense, especially even with music, like all of these things that we need. I think they're very important, and even the ways in which we articulate ourselves or speak. Because I always say I want to change the world, but when people ask like how, for me the only thing that I've seen through all of the research that I've done and looked at like how people try to change the world previously, I think the one thing that a lot of people haven't focused on is like changing the language in the way that we speak. Like how certain things, they're just words, but they can be so harmful. Like just saying that black women are strong, how harmful it is, to the point that doctors won't even give black women pain medication because they consider it as strong. So I always say that the way we change the world is how we can change our language specifically. So I don't want to be referred to as strong, because no other race or ethnicity of women is referred to as strong, and that's why it's so harmful towards black women specifically. So I would say it's like small things like that, changing the way that you speak about certain things, or the way that you comment on certain things. We need to be mindful of that. And
so I was just, as you were speaking, two things that come to mind. One is programming and reprogramming. So when you were speaking about books and the TV shows we choose to watch, the music we choose to listen to, that is all programming. And so at least with a book, you get to choose what you are being programmed by, because you get to buy the book or lend it from a library, because there's lots of different genres of books that you can find at a library that you might not find being sold out there. And so that's how we program ourselves. Then in terms of language being a way of changing the world, so if you're going to build a utopia, my approach was parenting. But I can see how language and parenting are kind of the same thing, because if you're parented into a language, you're parented into a culture. And if that culture is toxic, the parenting can be good, but the toxic nature of the language or the toxic nature of the culture would still then perpetuate toxicity, which means we won't have the utopia that I would have probably envisaged through that means, when we probably need non-violent language, or a language that removes violence from it, for us to then say violence is dead. I mean, even just that sentence, violence is dead. Dead is a violent thing, so we have to do something violent to violence for us to get rid of it. And I think that's because of the way we think, and that's the programming of our languages. Yeah. Well, I think we've been, sorry to hop on this programming thing, but we've been programmed to hate ourselves. And we've been programmed to therefore hate anything that looks like us. And so from that perspective is why I think identifying myself as black first already is a revolution, because I therefore make us all a family. And then also, I think this idea of the different cultures, subcultures, I guess, that come through music. So I'm thinking about reggae having a culture of its own, the Rastafari movement. It's also got a religion. Some people would follow the religious aspects of it. With hip hop as well, that's a culture now. To the point I brought up earlier, that you can participate in the art form and not be from the culture. I can do reggae music tomorrow, but I will never have the depth of understanding and vocabulary in that reggae world, because I haven't had dreadlocks for that long, or interacted with people from Jamaica, from Ethiopia, or even just read about them. To your point earlier, like just even understanding the history of Bob Marley and all the things that he was fighting, why the genre was created, how the genre was created, respecting all of those elements becomes important.
And I think also it's so important for us, especially in this day and age, to educate ourselves on like the past of like specifically Black people, who know about our history and where you come from, especially even you as an individual. Like generally, I think it's very important to know like about slavery and all of these things, about rights as women, or like all of the important topics. But then within yourself also, I think it's important as well to like do the history and the research about your own family, about your parents, about your grandparents, to understand specific things so you can understand your lineage and to understand why are you the way you are, and to also understand where you come from. So I think it's important for us as Black people to educate ourselves about those things and to put ourselves on, especially because you were saying that we are programmed to hate ourselves. So it's important for us to put ourselves on and watch things or consume things or engage in things that do not make us hate ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. And I think just speaking on identity and the history or ancestry, in terms of family tree and things like that, understanding when English interacts with you and your family tree explains a lot about identity, because from my perspective, I have an ancestor who spoke English because he interacted with the first missionaries or whatever. And so within my mom's line, English has kind of been multi-generational to the point where they don't even think about it. We're not aware of how much English we speak as a group. On my dad's side, my dad's grandmother was converted to Christianity and given an English name. And so English is not as entrenched on my dad's side. They speak a lot more vernac. And I did, in my early days, struggle with cousins making fun of me and things like that. And we have to navigate all of that, because at the end of the day, some people would feel that my dad's side is blacker, but it's all the Black experience. We're all suffering from the same subjugation. And when you speak about the history and understanding the history of Black suffering throughout the world, helps me then empathize with all Black people, because it might not be exactly the same. Just because someone didn't go through apartheid but they went through something different doesn't necessarily mean that we are now these separate things. We're still brothers in arms, because the system of white supremacy is still with us. The legacy of white supremacy is still with us. And so that learning then helps us build together a unity, and that unity is our strength, because that's probably how we got to this place of hating each other, is because they used a tactic called divide and conquer. So they made you feel your identity to the point where you now see other people as not your brothers and sisters. Yet these tribes used to intermarry. These tribes used to have joint celebrations. Yet now we think of tribes as if they're these different nations competing. Competition didn't exist back then in the way that we think of it now. And that again points to the fact that we're limited by the language. There might have been a different vocabulary before the English language came with this idea of us and them. That one is a tough one, because coconut is a loaded term, and there was a period of time where we took pride in that term. Some people did, because of the rewards that you get and the proximity you have to whiteness. If you're able to articulate yourself that well, and you're able to assimilate into white spaces, and you speak so well, you're not like them, and so that became some kind of positive reinforcement for you to be incentivized to becoming a coconut. And it's only when you become older and adult that you realize all the manipulation that went into that, all the programming that goes into you tap dancing to try and be enough in a space that at the end of the day was never designed for you to be enough. When I speak about the history, I look at the example of the formation of the ANC as an example to say the formation of the ANC was an assimilation attempt. And the attempt succeeded, but it divided the black community within the South African history context. And so these black people that saw themselves as educated, land owning, property owning, participating in capitalism within the black community felt like it wasn't fair for white people to be treating them like everyone else. And then later on, you find that now, when the white people and the Dutch people, when the English people and the Dutch people then teamed up against them, they were then reminded that they were black after all. And they were stripped of that privilege that they had had. And so your privilege doesn't take away from your blackness. And that's something that we have to constantly be keeping in mind, that we're not better than any other person, full stop. And we're not any better than any other black person, just because of the way that they speak, the way that they sound, or the words that they choose to use or not use, the identity and culture. Because yes, just because I identify myself as black first doesn't mean a person who identifies themselves as Zulu first is necessarily an enemy. We are still all one family, is how I try and think about these things.
And I would agree too, because there's a lot of people who can use big words and have been to the best schools, but they're not the smartest person. They're not, when they're speaking, it's not necessarily that they're saying something deep, or you learning, or you getting wisdom from that conversation. So yeah, I would re-emphasize on the point that don't equate English to intelligent. And just because you speak well does not necessarily mean that you're smart or that you're better than anybody else. Especially, it also feels like such a reprogramming, and like it's like thinking that you won when you never won. They will never reach you. So that kind of makes me sad, in that sense that people think that putting yourself in those situations, equating yourself to that whiteness makes you think that you're better, when in reality they're never ever gonna reach you. You'll still be the bottom of the barrel to them. So
no, unless they can use you, and they'll put you at the top for those 4 minutes when you're useful to them. Exactly. And then as soon as you're not useful, they will spit you out like chewing gum. And move on to the next one, because there's always a long string of black people willing to sell their own people, willing to exploit the culture in some way for profit. Well, for me, the first thing that comes up when you ask that question around feeling judged or being seen a particular way is, I've never liked the term "gore gore." It's always been personal for me, because the country I was born in, I was a gore gore in that country. And so I'm like, but I was born here. And yet they're like, yeah, but your Ndebele is not Ndebele enough. It sounds more like Zulu, so you're not really from here. And then I went to Botswana, I was called a Gore again. And they're like, yeah, no, you're coming from Zim. And I'm like, but in Zim they didn't accept me, now you guys are not accepting me. And then I come to South Africa and I'm like, okay, I have a South African passport. My grandparents were South African. Now I'm going to be accepted. I'm coming home. Nope, Gore, you were born outside of South Africa, you're not South African. So I've constantly had this being the outsider. And maybe that's why I have to defend myself by identifying as black, by identifying with the broader group, by identifying myself with African Americans in particular, because they, like me, have this broken history story where I don't know like the deep Zulu stuff. I don't know the deep Shona things. I don't know the deep Shangaan things, but I'm supposed to be I have aspects of those cultures within me.
So I feel judged a lot growing up, because I look colored, but then I'm not colored. So then when I'll speak English, so people would assume I'm colored, but I'm not colored, because even the coloreds don't accept me. So growing up, I always hated that we spoke English and that my dad never taught me an African language. But obviously now that I'm grown, I understand. And that just me having that feeling judged or whatever made me kind of, well, I don't know if that's what made me be good with languages, but I am good with languages in comparison to my siblings. So I always learned how to speak that language to kind of fit in or speak vernacular. And then, yeah, I would say going to a Model C school, I did feel kind of judged not having that twang, the Model C English. But yeah, that's also when I realized like having that twang or Model C English does not necessarily mean you intelligent or that you're smart or whatever. I think it's really dependent on everything. Yeah, I think that's been my experience. Like I would say, when it comes to our language, certain things like I'm a good or whatever, it's so important for us to check ourselves and also be very mindful of the language that we use, because we specifically only use that language when it applies to black people. It's like we have so many Europeans or Australians or whatever who come from different places of Africa, and we don't call them Amagwelgwele, or they don't bear the brand of us calling other people Amagwelgwele. But when Africans, our fellow Africans and brothers and sisters come into South Africa, South Africans have this thing where we see ourselves as the pinnacle of Africa, and this, which is also problematic because we're not, and then like make it make sense. So I think in terms of language and the way we see other black people, we need to check ourselves, and also just the way we constantly calling for white people or colored people. Just we also need to check that as well, because if a white person or colored person comes and starts speaking broken Xhosa or broken Zulu, we start congratulating them, we start going above and beyond, calling for them. Then we get someone like me who makes a mistake in a Xhosa word or something, I'm gonna be ridiculed when it's like I know how to speak better Xhosa than most people who aren't even Xhosa. I'm not even Xhosa when people assume that. So like just like certain things that we need to do in our day-to-day lives that we're not really aware of and how harmful they are, that I think we need to change as well and check out within ourselves and even in like our families or our friendship connections, because they can be harmful to that extent. And then
challenging stereotypes. So I think my thing is that people don't realize that we all have privilege, and conflict usually goes along the lines of what your privilege is. So even when we get into the conversation around foreign nationals, as an example, that idea of South African exceptionalism, which on the African continent, there is definitely the sense that there is more depth of history and knowledge about South Africa at a general knowledge level than there is about any of the other African countries within the continent. I think Egypt and South Africa are exceptional in that sense, where anyone in the world can identify these two places within Africa, and then the rest of Africa is Africa. So there's privilege within that, and acknowledging that privilege and then learning how to let go of it, because privilege in itself, kind of speaking to programming, it's a form of violence to think of yourself as exceptional to the other people on the continent. And that is exactly how you're participating in the divide and conquer that led to the conquering of the continent. So I think we do need to realize that just because someone isn't as proximate to Zulu, but they make an attempt, we shouldn't be ridiculing that person, but helping them, encouraging them regardless of whether their skin is white or black. Because yes, there is definitely this doing backflips when you see a white person speaking vernacular. But yeah, it's not necessarily the same, because it's assumed you should know these languages if you're black. But yeah, no, just because I walked into Botswana at a certain age, I had to learn the language from scratch. And I was learning it from people who necessarily didn't want to give me the history lessons. I had to figure that out on my own. I had to learn how to listen to people and start to build an idea of what the culture is and why they chose the words that they chose and how they put them together. Because literally there is a textbook on how to learn Setswana, but I didn't learn Setswana formally. I had to learn it for myself to help build an identity that became acceptable in that space. Yeah.
And even most black people, especially, well, most black people, but let's talk about South Africans specifically. Most of us are multilingual or bilingual, standard procedure for us to think. And even if you're not going to be able to speak it, you'll be able to understand and pendula in your answer in your own language or specifically English. But then with white people, most of them can't necessarily do that. Well, they will be fluent in other languages such as Russian, German, Spanish, all of those type of languages. And that's why I never give white people slack when it comes to the pronunciation of our names or not being able to speak our language. It's not that they can't, they just don't want to.
Yeah, and they kind of haven't had to.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, when you speak about languages and the fact that we're all multilingual, again, there's another layer of privilege within that, because within the South African context, there are probably four main languages, four main vernac languages, even though vernac is not a nice term to use. And so imagine how it feels to be one of those languages that is not expected to be heard, that is not, because you see, so there's already a silencing of other identities that exist, like a language like Libubedu, in the language groups, even within what is called Khoisan, which is incorrect, the Khoi and Twa people, there's multiple groupings within that, but because of our textbooks from Europe, we now lump all of those people and erase all the specificity within their culture to give them this one amorphous term.
And even with our 11 official languages, it's like you have the main, like Zulu, Xhosa, and then I even don't know the difference between Sotho, Swedish, and
It's a fine line, but that's where...
Like, so it kind of goes back to your point of us just lumping the people that we don't necessarily, like, not really speaking most of your language, so it's like, you guys just sound the same.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I think all these things come from somewhere, and some people have access to the history, and other people don't have access to the history. And the people who don't have access, it's not necessarily always the case that people don't want to, or that they're choosing willful ignorance. It's just that the people who know assume everyone knows.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I don't look at it in terms of bad guys and good guys. We're not beefing as black people as a whole. So we do need to find each other and help each other. I mean, the one thing that we need to lead with is respect. I think you can tell the difference between people who have respect and people who do not have respect for a particular thing. And the one example I would use is a tourist that goes to the reed dance, as an example. That's a cultural event with a specific context, and if you go there to consume that event, if you go there with a capitalist mindset that thinks, oh, this is amazing, look at all these virgin girls walking around half naked, that's not what's happening. It's what's happening for you and from your perspective. And if you have enough respect for the people that you're visiting and the cultural moment that you're participating in, then you would look at it in the appropriate way that you should be looking at it from. So I think that's one example of things that become dangerous in terms of trying to now wear people's culture as a costume. And so that you just want to know enough so you can get by, and then once you're in, then you continue to act out contrary to how those people would appreciate you acting. Because, I mean, you can speak enough Zulu to get there, but then once you're there, you still have to then continue to protect those girls like they're your young sister. You shouldn't now be a predator in that environment, because the predation is not part of the culture. That's a moment of honoring those women, and yet you are trying to almost, I don't know what perverted ideas you would be coming to such an event with.
I would also say I urge the people who can to educate themselves and read, and also have, it's so important that you said respect, because we always constantly forget, especially in today's day and age, which I always say, of thinking that you don't owe anybody anything else, when we do have, as a human being, you have a care of duty for another person, despite it being your family, despite it being your sister, whatever. You just have the duty of care for other human beings. So it's important for us to do that and respect the different cultures as well as the languages, and educate yourself as well in the ability that you can as well. So yeah, and especially as us Black people, I think that we're very strong in the sense that we can move to different countries, especially as foreign nationals, like my dad being a foreign national and just moving to a new country and creating your own family when you're away from your family, and being able to, some people don't even speak English, you get family members who don't even speak English and they continue raising kids who speak English, taking them to schools, and I think that's like just something to be proud of. And it's not a lot of things that a lot of people can do, but because it's just so normalized for Black people or people of color to be strong and to be able to get through things, we take that lightly about how many people are able to go to countries where they can't even speak the language and create new families just for a better future, to break generational curses, and to just not want to repeat the same mistakes that happened, or for the kids to have better opportunities than they had. So I think that's something that we tend to forget, and I think we're very strong in that sense, and it's something that we should be proud of, but we need to just give ourselves grace as Black people as well as the other Black people that are not necessarily from the same tribes or cultures as us. We need to give them grace as well, because we are one, and if no one's free and this, no one's free.
No, true. And then I watched a podcast recently. It's a Swati podcast, and they zoomed in on their origin as a tribe, and their origin story is kind of like it's very similar to other cultures, to the point where when some of the Pan-Africanists start to say, you know what, all of these royal families is just divide and conquer. There was one monoculture, and that monoculture got broken out as people had to migrate due to whatever was causing them to migrate, and then also with colonization happening and the slave trade happening, people had to run away, and therefore, like you're saying, form new families in new spaces, form new tribes or settlements in new spaces, and so they would then almost adapt their culture to their environment, and they might meet neighbors and then assimilate into those neighboring cultures, yet still trying to preserve certain aspects of their own culture. And that's why when we look around the African continent now, or that's one of the participating or contributing things that makes us not recognize each other. But yet, when we go further and further back, we were once one thing.
Okay guys, we've reached the end of today's episode. If you guys have made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Mbongeni, for being here once again.
It's a pleasure.
And we have the book of the week. So I was going to choose a different book, but because of the topic for this conversation, I think this book is important. It's by our fave, a mogul. It's Black Looks, and it's Race and Representation by Bell Hooks. So highly recommend it. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. See you in 2 weeks.
Cheers.
Bye.